So this interview is being conducted for Georgia State University's Social Change Collection. I am Peter Roberts, and I'm interviewing Nancy Duncan. The date is June 28th, 2013, and I am in Nancy's home in Chamblee, Georgia. Let's start with your early life, where you were born, some information about your parents and challenges you faced in education, whatever.
Okay. My father was a Baptist minister all my growing up years, and he was a pastor of a church near Orlando, Florida, a little town called Groveland, back in the height of the Orange Grove time. And I was born on July the 3rd, which is coming up, and my parents were my father was just out of seminary. It was his first full-time church, and they didn't have probably 2 nickels to rub together. But when I was born, I had a double cleft palate and a hair lip.
Okay.
And the doctor, a small town doctor, said, most of these children don't live. And we didn't until during World War II, they developed the first real surgery that corrected a cleft palate.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, if we can get her to the right doctor quickly enough, she can survive.
Mm-hmm.
So my father called his first cousin, who lived here in Atlanta, who was a nurse at what we call Scottish Rite. And she said, this is just a miracle because I just started being a surgical assistant to the first doctor in the Southeast who does cleft palate repair.
Okay.
And she came down and got me in Orlando, and I flew back to Atlanta when I was 5 days old with her in her arms. And I was on my own at Scottish Rite for a couple of months while they did some of the initial surgeries. And so I started off having to fight for life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think pretty much the folks that my family, and it's been a great sorrow to me that none of my family was at the hospital with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't figure that out. Now later they were, but I think they all thought I would die, and they just didn't want to get too invested.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to imagine that at this point, but people do the best they can. And so I had I think 4 surgeries before I was 2. So a lot of my first years were in hospitals.
Okay.
And then things were, I had, sometimes I think that I am more self-conscious about my hair lip than I am about being blind,
Mm-hmm.
because everybody notices that.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't figure out that I had a visual impairment till I was 12.
Okay.
I went, to school, and public school. I could read the blackboard. I could read regular print. I could write and play jump rope and all those things. When I was 9, one of the really blessings of my life happened in that my father took a church in North Georgia, Hartwell, Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's the town where my dad's mother lived, and she was my greatest champion, and she just really gave me a lot of strength and a lot of encouragement, and she was always there for me
Mm-hmm.
when I was young and in high school and college and all that. When I got ready to I would say I was just pretty much average kid. I did well in school, but and I had my friends and all that. But then I was diagnosed at 12 with retinitis pigmentosa,
Mm-hmm.
and the doctor told my parents in front of me that I would gradually lose my sight and probably be totally blind at some point in the future. And my mother said, what should we do? And he said, just take her home and take care of her.
Uh-huh.
So, of course, that's the last thing I wanted, was to be taken care of forever by my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents and I always argued about things. I was always questioning and pointing out their hypocrisy. I was just reading a book, and it was talking about that young people think that their families are always hypocrites and don't ever follow their own teachings. You know, young people are so hard on their parents. And you have to be about 50 before you learn that your parents are human beings and you don't need to be, blaming them for anything wrong in your life. But I certainly, was critical of them, and we didn't have the best relationship, but my grandmother and I did. And when I was ready to go to high school, the principal of the high school called my dad and said, she can't come to high school because she can't read fast enough. My reading speed had gone way down because of my vision, lack of vision. And so my dad said, okay, and what do we do? And he said, well, there's a school for the blind down in Macon, and that's where she needs to go. And I just had a fit. I cried and carried on, and I called my grandmother, of course, and my grandmother called two of her best friends, who were two of the wealthier people, older ladies in town, and they all called the superintendent of schools. and they said, this is ridiculous. This is a smart young lady. We don't want to separate her from her friends and her family. This is the time when she needs her family, not to be separated. And so he said, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. And my grandmother and her two elderly friends, lady friends, said, we will read for Nancy if she needs anything read. And they did. One of them would come over to our house after school and read assignments to me, and then my grandmother was always reading for me. She went to college and actually to graduate school, and she finished college in 1914, which was very rare.
Yes.
And she finished graduate school in 1914, and so she knew French and Latin. And of course she had never taken chemistry or physics or any of that. So when it came to those, she just had to read, and she didn't anymore know what it was than if she'd been reading German or Greek or something. But she read to me, and I figured it out. But I was determined, and she was determined, that we were going to prove to that school board and the principal that I could do it. And I graduated second in my class. And with all A's.
My goodness.
And then I did took a national merit test, and scored a semifinalist in that. And so then colleges started recruiting me, which was really wonderful. And my father, again, being a Baptist minister, said, you have to go to a Baptist college. So it was between Mercer and Furman.
Okay. Furman
is in South Carolina, Mercer, of course, here in Georgia. And I went to Furman, and it was just probably one of the happiest days of my life, the day I started college. And Furman was a wonderful, wonderful place. It was excellent liberal arts, small, very small. I think we had 1,500 students my freshman year. And so you got to know, not all the students, but you certainly got to know the professors. And they would have us to their homes, and they'd sit in the student center and discuss current events. And I went to school at a wonderful time, the late 60s. So all the Vietnam War stuff, and the Kent State and Civil Rights Movement, and all that was going on big time. So it was a wonderful time to be in college. One of the things that was vital to my going to college was that between my junior and senior year in high school, vocational rehabilitation sponsored a summer program for college students. Or college-bound students who had gone to public school. Because then, back in the 60s, there was no special ed. There were no supportive services. You just had to negotiate everything. And because my family was a more prominent family in town, and my grandmother was looming in the background saying she will get what she needs, the high school teachers, accommodated me wonderfully, beautifully. And but I didn't know Braille. I didn't know anything that I would need in college in terms of adaptive skills for being blind, and my vision was going fast. So by the time I was a junior in high school, I couldn't read. Well, I could read if it was very big, like if I wrote it, but I couldn't read anything that was in print. So we got. I went to the summer program down at the School for the Blind with other young people who were visually impaired. And I learned Braille, and I learned to sew, and I took some pipe organ lessons, and I learned to use a cane, and just learned about some of the resources, and met some lovely teachers who taught there.
You said that was between high school and college?
It was between junior and senior year in high school.
Junior and senior in high school, okay.
And it was really sad that year. This was one of the first times that I realized there was not yet an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Was I would have gone to, that was the first year they had, the second year they had Governor's Honors Program in Macon.
Okay.
And my English teacher really wanted me to go, but the program in Macon said, "Oh, we don't think we can handle a blind student," and so I didn't get to go. And of course, I wound up in Macon, but at the School for the Blind, which was quite a long distance in abilities from Governor's Honors Program. But I couldn't have done college if I hadn't have gone that summer and learned Braille and learned, some other independent skills. So it was really a blessing, even though it was heartbreaking to me to not be able to go to the Governor's Honors Program.
What did you imagine that your career would be when you were in college?
Well, I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a journalist. And my idea, I worked on the newspaper when I was in high school, and I had some articles published in our city paper, a small town paper. And I won several contests where you had to write about a certain topic. I won a DAR contest, and I won some other contest. I can't think what it was, but where you had to write about why you're this or why you're that. And I won a couple of those, so I really wanted to be a journalist. And of course I was very politically interested in all kinds of things, and so that fit in. And I went to college with the idea of getting a major in something like sociology or anthropology or history, and then going to maybe the Grady School of Journalism for a master's degree. As I said, college was a great experience. We still didn't have any laws about disability. We didn't have that. We didn't have anything, anything like a Disability Student Services Department. But the school dean Furman asked the head of the psychology department to be my faculty advisor, even though I wasn't going to be in psychology. Because her background was in working with children with special needs. And so she was very supportive and very encouraging, and if I had an idea that this would help me, she would kind of go to bat for me, and she was very well respected at the school.
Would you say this was Furman's first experience with a student with your disability?
They had one other blind student, but she only went, I think, for one semester.
Okay.
And she didn't do well academically, and I don't know whether it was because she didn't have the accommodations she needed, or she wasn't really interested in going to school. I don't know the whys. I met her, and she was, when I met her, it was 2 years after she'd gone to school. She was what we certainly called a hippie then, very anti-establishment. So I imagine she just decided, well, school's not for me. But go ahead.
How did they accommodate, in terms of, would they have to create Braille for you, or did you have someone read for you, or?
Well, I had people read for me. The Services for the Blind, Voc Rehab in Georgia, paid for readers for
Okay.
me. I forgot, so much an hour,
Mm-hmm.
and then you could get books recorded by then from the live. It's called. It was then the Recording for the Blind
Mhm.
studios in New York, and so you could send them your textbooks, and they would record them and send you the tapes.
Okay.
Then we used tape because reel-to-reel tapes,
Mhm.
and and then the school, we had a full-time nurse in the infirmary in the women's dorm, and she, of course, was not busy a lot of the time,
Mhm.
and so the school actually had her read for me,
Okay.
and they had another student who, as part of her work study, did some reading for
Mhm.
me. So, and then professors gave me tests orally, and sometimes they would, want you to go do research in the library, and there was not much way to do that unless I had, somebody to go with me
Mhm.
and read me what they found. So a lot of times my professors would, we had a big catalog of stuff that had already been recorded, and they would look at that and pick out some things that were already recorded that I could read in lieu of doing the research in the library.
Mhm. Your transition to graduate school, and I see that you went eventually studied seminary.
Yeah.
Okay, and can you talk about the sort of your move into towards seminary and then your move into counseling?
Well, when I was in college, I met and fell in love with another student, and we married right out of college.
Mhm.
Like, we married 2 weeks after we graduated, and had a big traditional wedding and all
Mhm.
that in 1970. I had a hard time finding a job,
Mhm.
and we lived in Greenville, where I went to school for a year. And I did get a job working with Headstart, but that just really wasn't a good fit for me
Mhm.
because I had some very ADHD 4-year-olds,
Okay.
and I didn't even have an aide,
Okay.
and so that didn't work. So I only worked there for a few months, and they actually, the head of Head Start wanted me to have the position, but my immediate supervisor said she can't do it.
Mhm.
And so whenever anything went wrong, somebody hit somebody or wet the floor or
Mhm.
fell down, it was because I was not able to do it,
Mhm.
And so she finally said, after just about 3 months, I think you'd be happier in another job. And I
Mhm.
said, well, that's for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but going to work, was much harder. I mean, I'd really done well in school and living independently, away from home, and all that. I had just a normal life, except very few people were willing to give me an opportunity in work. And I had a lot of vision then,
Mhm.
and I was still pretty high low vision.
Okay.
And in terms of going about going places, and I got a guide dog in '71.
Okay.
And that gave me, I could then go shopping and go out and get a cup of coffee on my own, or I took the bus and went places, and so that was a really good thing. That was probably the guide dog. I tell people that the guide dog was the way that I became comfortable saying I'm blind,
Okay.
because people were all interested in talking about the guide dog, and that seemed to me better than talking about me.
Mhm.
And so it was a good transition to being an advocate. That's
Okay.
probably at 71, was about the first time that I was a real advocate for people who are blind or have disabilities. But I didn't go to graduate school until 73.
Mhm.
And again, I finally got a job in 72, working for the state of South Carolina Services for the Blind. Then they paid for me to start my graduate degree in rehab counseling.
Okay.
And like many times, the state paid for me for a year, and then they ran out of money,
Okay.
and I needed one more year. So I got a grad assistantship And even though my degree was in rehab counseling, what I really was interested in was counseling, because I felt like that people who have disabilities, if they're at a good place mentally and emotionally, can figure out how to get the other things they need, how to advocate for them, and how to push for them, and if they feel good about themselves and feel like they are valuable and important. And I worked with so many clients in rehab that we taught them lots of skills, and they developed self-confidence when they were at our center, and then they went home and their families didn't want them to get out on their independently, and so we're just very protective, and in a matter of a year they were back where they were before they came to us.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that you needed to look at families, and you needed to help the individual feel strong and empowered. So I got a grad assistantship in the counseling center at the University of South Carolina, and I helped start the first services for disabled students at that university.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very, very interesting and very fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had my first child a month after I got my master's degree.
Okay.
And so I stayed home for a couple of years with her, and then I went to work in alcohol and drug abuse prevention and intervention.
Okay.
And that's a lot harder than working with people who have disabilities.
Okay.
Not that a lot of people with disabilities don't have alcohol and drug abuse too.
Mm-hmm.
But I worked in that field for I am going to get to graduate school or seminary. Okay. I worked in that field for, I think, about 6 years, and I was very successful and did a lot of things all over the state, and in fact taught some courses, week-long courses. I went out to California and studied under William Glasser, who was the psychiatrist that did the thing on reality therapy and
Mm-hmm.
positive addictions.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like a field counselor working with his organization, and did some private counseling then too, and some group counseling at our center. But I realized still that health, mental health, it's part. You have to be part of a community,
Mm-hmm.
or a community makes it a lot easier. And so I just, I decided that what people needed more than individual counseling was they needed to be part of a positive community. And I felt like the most positive community could be the church.
Okay.
And so that's part of what led me to start exploring going to seminary.
Okay.
And the head of the Lutheran seminary, I was living then in Columbia, South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
was a very inspired man, and he became later the bishop of the Lutheran Church in America. But he was very positive, and thought that I would be an excellent pastor, because I had a master's in counseling, and then I had done all kinds of public speaking and managed a $500,000 program at the alcohol and drug abuse place, and so I had some good skills behind me.
Mm-hmm.
And so he really encouraged me to come to the Lutheran seminary, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I had some good, wonderful professors. Still, that was in 82 and 83, so there was still no law to help me. It was just, I would ask a professor, can we do this? And most of them were very, very gracious and helpful. And the first semester I was there, I had to take Greek. So I was able to get a copy of the New Testament in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And in Braille, all the languages have to use the English alphabet.
Okay.
Because they don't have enough symbols to do all the other kinds of figures that you would have.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have to learn to read the Greek alphabet, at least.
Okay.
but I couldn't get, my books. I couldn't get the textbook at all. So a retired Greek professor who was like 84 years old, he came over to my house every day. I was right on campus. And he came over to my apartment every day after class and helped me and tutored me in my Greek.
My gracious.
And that was such a lovely thing because he needed to feel needed, and I certainly needed his help.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a gracious, wonderful gentleman. And he died right after the next year. So I felt really good that he knew how important he had been to me, you know, and that's a lot of people at that age don't feel like they have much to give. But I didn't finish seminary because you had to do your internship at a church as an assistant pastor before you could do your last year of study.
Okay.
And they could not find me a church that would accept me.
Okay.
And for all the other students, the churches simply said, yes, we'll take an intern. But the head of the internship program thought, well, a church should have extra opportunity to decide whether they want a blind intern. So I went through about 10 times more hoops than any of the other, and I was married again by this time. Joe and I married in 83.
Okay.
And so I was a divorced woman who was blind. And in the Lutheran church, I might as well have been from Mars.
Okay.
But maybe Mars would have been more acceptable because they weren't exactly happy about women yet, and there were plenty of divorced men who had positions, but not divorced women. And I had a child by my first marriage, who was 8 at that time. And and as I said, there were plenty of men that were in the same situation, but it was because I was blind. They just felt like, well, if somebody's dying and somebody has to help you go to the funeral home, are you going to be a sufficiently strong leader? And I had done internships, many internships. I'd done one at the state mental hospital, and one of the really lovely experiences of my whole life was on Christmas Eve. They asked me if I would. I was a chaplain,
Okay.
and they asked me if I would do a Christmas Eve service at the hospital, and I said yes, I'd love to do that. And so they had told me when I started working at the hospital. They said, we'll make sure that you're never alone on the floor with the patients, that there'll be somebody else around in case something happens. So I never had any trouble. The patients were wonderful, very accepting, very supportive of me. And when they were really having trouble, a lot of them would ask for me especially. Because I think they felt like they couldn't say to me, well, you have no idea what it's like, They couldn't say that to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're doing a Christmas Eve communion service, and I spoke and we sang, and then we were doing communion, and I suddenly realized that there was probably 100 patients and not a single staff person.
Okay.
And here I was, that you'll never be by yourself. But it was probably the most meaningful Christmas Eve I've had in my whole life was doing communion with those 100 patients in the mental hospital. And but I couldn't get a church.
Okay.
So fortunately, my husband then got a wonderful job offer. He was in graduate school all this time. And so we moved to North Carolina. And we moved to Durham. So I thought, I can finish at Duke.
Okay.
But I went to Duke to do some volunteer work at the Eye Center because I got to be friends with a professor there. And I loved it, and they hired me. And so I did counseling with people losing their vision or families of infants that found out their babies would never see. And it was a very wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. So I just felt like, well, this is where I'm supposed to be, and maybe someday I'll finish seminary, maybe I won't. And I haven't.
Can you talk a little bit about what that whole process of getting families to accept the situation,
Sure.
and or just people to empower people to do the best of their ability, or that kind of thing.
Well, I think that I lead a lot of workshops all over I have led a lot of workshops all over the country. And one of the first things that I always talk about is myths.
Say that again.
Myth, like Greek myth.
Myth, okay.
M-Y-T-H, myth. And so I talk about the myths that you have about disability or blindness in that case in particular. And, to try to help people, most people have an idea somebody old is blind,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody very dependent, and there's somebody who is isolated and, who can't take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And just meeting me, who's a mom by then, a mother of 3, and, has a career and degrees and, keeps a home and has a loving husband and just does all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
That right then says a whole lot to that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And then I talk to them about all the possibilities. And I say, you can look at this. The parents usually think, oh, my child will never see the stars,
Mm-hmm.
or my child will never see the ocean, or my child will never see color.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I talk to them about your child won't do this, but they'll do this. And, I said, it's a wonderful, the world of books is available now to people with visual impairment because they're recorded and you can download them. And that was in 1986 and 7 and 8
Okay.
that I'm talking about. And now there's 100 ways more of getting recorded books, Audible and all the, downloads and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, and so it opens up tremendous worlds. I said, if I traveled to Florence, Italy, I couldn't see all the architecture and paintings, but I can read a book on the art of Florence,
Mm-hmm.
and really get a wonderful description. And, it's not the same, but it is of equal quality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to just help people understand that if your child's never seen, they don't miss color.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I could see color at one time. Now I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I miss the color of the flowers.
Mm-hmm.
But my brain makes up pictures. And so I know that there are all kinds of flowers in my front yard. And even though I can't see them, whenever I look toward that window, I imagine what they look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes forget that I don't really see them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I could see. So we have memories. There's frustration
Mm-hmm.
in that you can't get places you want to go. I mean, that's probably my biggest frustration. My 2 biggest frustrations, this will sound really strange, is that, I'm always, it's very hard to just say, oh, I feel like I want an ice cream. I'm going to get in the car and go get me an ice cream. I
Okay.
can't ever do something spontaneous like
Okay.
that usually, unless I have staff here and they say, yeah, let's go,
Okay.
but on my own I can't. And the second thing, now this is really silly, but this happens 100 times a day probably. I'm opening something and I know full well that there's the little letters on here and a little arrow and you pull this little tab.
Okay.
But since I can't see, this is something that, I hadn't bought before, we'll
Mm-hmm.
say. Since I can't see, I don't know how you're supposed to open this thing.
Okay. The safety caps.
Yeah, all these little things where you
Yeah.
twist and
Uh-huh.
twist it toward the arrow and all that. And that aggravates me because it's, not any way that I can really do that. I've just got to do trial and error, and I still may not get it.
Mm-hmm.
But those are little things. Everybody has, little things that aggravate them, and so that's why. One of my most interesting visits was I got a call from the head of the eye clinic, and he asked me, could you come on Christmas Eve and meet a patient who's just been admitted?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, he's on our board of trustees. And so he said, and he's a personal friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, sure, I'll do that. And so my husband, I was pregnant, and my husband, we had to bring our little son because we had just adopted him, and he's also blind. And so my husband took me over to the hospital, and I went in to see the gentleman. And the first thing he asked me was, do you have high blood pressure? And I said, sir, and he said, well, he said, seems to me that blindness would be so stressful. And I said, well, I do have some high blood pressure, and it is stressful, and I have to make sure I give myself time to rest and relax and recover from the stress. So we started talking a little bit, and then he had just been injured in a hunting accident and lost his vision just like that, immediately. And I was talking to his wife and daughter, and I said, we can get somebody in privately to help him learn some independent skills, and he can fix himself a cup of coffee or a toast or a muffin or something in the microwave. She says, oh, honey, we have servants. He won't have to do that. And it brought home to me what I know full well is that it's a matter of money as to how serious your disability is.
Okay.
Now, you might not be able to walk whether you're poor or rich, but if you have money, you can pay somebody to do physical therapy with you every day, and you can pay somebody else to assist you in and out of your wheelchair, and you can pay somebody to make your home fully accessible, and you can buy a great van so that you can get in and out and maybe drive yourself. But if you're poor, a lot of those options are not there.
The one of the questions I have relates to kind of like the lessons that you've learned about politics or people's perceptions in terms of the idea of money can certainly change the situation, but anyway, just in general, to talk a bit about people's perceptions of persons with disabilities and sort of the politics of the whole issue.
Right. Well, it goes back to what I was saying about myths. I think people think that people with disabilities are poor and uneducated, and generally speaking, they think that we're a little slow mentally because people talk to me like I'm dumb, or they, if they haven't met me, and they may just totally discount my ability or the ability of people with disabilities to discount our abilities to contribute in any way. And I always tell people, I say one of the smartest people in the world and one of the most wealthiest people in the world are both people with significant disabilities. And that would be Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates. And, so it's not, and they're not people that were in an accident and became disabled. That Bill Gates would have been always had that disability of Asperger's. And our world would be a sad place without people with Asperger's, because we wouldn't have Albert Einstein or Mozart or Beethoven or a whole lot of other people whose names I don't even know. And I think that the movie, A Beautiful Mind, was, he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. And if you just shut him away somewhere because he had a mental disability, you would lose all of his knowledge. He's one of the people that developed some of the cutting edge physics and math and all that, equations. And I'm not even smart enough to know about what it all was, but there's lots of situations where people just underestimate. I went to a retreat once, and there was a woman there who had CP, cerebral palsy, and she was in a wheelchair. She was very difficult to understand, but she could type with one finger, and she wrote poetry, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was really class act poetry, and I was just sort of dismissing her, because that she couldn't talk, and she was very difficult to talk And so, I thought she's not too smart, and then I totally reevaluated. So I think that's the big thing, is that they don't think we can contribute. They don't think we have skills, and we don't have all the skills, because I can't drive a car, but that doesn't mean I can't contribute. And I think oftentimes politicians view us as charity. We have to take care of these people. Well, that's not what we want. We don't want to be taken care of. We want to be contributors. We want to feel like we're valued, and we're really a part of the community. And that's the real problem in education and in employment. It's amazing.
Is it in terms of when somebody has either it's sudden that you become disabled, or if it's gradual, in terms of the empowering that person to accept the situation and make the most of their ability?
Well, it depends on probably who the person was before they became disabled. I mean, there are some people that are put down and beaten down by family or friends or the system, school system. If you're told enough, you're stupid and you can't do anything, it's awful hard to disagree, especially when you're young and you don't have many options. But if a person is a go-getter in high school, and they're in a wreck and become quadriplegic, if they have support at all, they probably will continue to be a go-getter. But a lot of times, a family member needs to feel needed too, and so they try to take over this disabled person's life and say, "I'll take care of you." And the individual with a disability is not sure how much they can do, or whether it's a gradual loss or a sudden loss. I think in general, if the older you are, and I don't mean 60s and 70s, but I mean if you're in your 20s when you become disabled, you're probably a lot less likely to become totally dependent. Because you've had the ability to go out and do things and have options. When you're born with a disability and your family spends a lot of time taking care of you and convincing you, not by what they say, but by what they do, that you've got to be taken care of, I think it takes an extra lot of energy and chutzpah to stand up for yourself. As you're really taught from an early age, this is the way it's going to be.
Can you describe some of the changes when you started, in a sense, working in the field of helping those others with disability and working with politicians and organizations for the disabled, how the changes that have happened, the changes you've experienced,
Well, one of the things that I laugh about, my family always laughs, is when we go to a store, and I'm going to use a store name now, but we go to this big Target that's new. It's just several years old. And when you come out, there's all this rough sidewalk, these bumps. And every time I say, "Thank you, ADA," because the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's one of the things that early on helped people with visual impairments, especially, is these bumps. They call it detectable warnings. And it lets you know that there's something dangerous coming up. They're on the edge of platforms on the train, in the MARTA stations. Where there's a sidewalk that just simply gradually slopes down into the street or the parking lot. A blind person has no idea whether they're on the sidewalk or in the parking lot without those bumps. And so something that simple can mean your life, because we had, before they put the bumps on the MARTA station platform, there are 26 people in Atlanta within 2 years fell into the train, whatever you call it, where the train goes.
Mm-hmm.
None of them were killed, but there were people killed in San Francisco and New York.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that are very concrete. It's much. I think people think about disability now. Our agency, we've been working with Disability Resource Group, the agency that I've been the director of for 20 years. Our whole purpose was to get disability on everybody's radar, whether we're talking about the health department or a school or emergency planners or doctor's offices, so that it would just be something everybody thought of. When I was growing up, nobody thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say one of my strong philosophical and spiritual beliefs is that something good can come out of anything, no matter how bad it is.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, we have a lot of laws protecting people with disabilities because of the Vietnam veterans.
Okay.
And now we're having all kinds of awareness of traumatic brain injury because of the Iraqi and Afghanistan veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's changed the idea of people not being aware at all. Now you never ride the MARTA train that you don't see somebody with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And there's most of the people you can't tell they have a disability. So
Mm-hmm.
I was showing somebody a picture of a meeting the other day, and they said, "Well, there's no disabled people there." Oh, they said, "No, I see one person in a wheelchair." And I said, "Well, you can't see most disabilities. How do you know a deaf person's deaf? By looking at them.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know." But I think people are aware now more that disability is just a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one good thing about baby boomers is more and more of us are going to have disabilities. So the majority of the population may have a disability before too long.
Yeah, it seems to me that at some point in everyone's life, they're at a point where they are disabled in terms of whether they're admitted to a hospital and they're dependent or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to ask about the accomplishments of the Disability Resource Group, in a sense, how that actually happened, that you were able to accomplish the things that you did accomplish.
Well, I wrote a lot of grants.
Okay.
And I got money from, I think we counted up one time, I think we'd have like 18 different grants. And they were to do, one of the big things that we did was we began to work with immigrants and refugees with disabilities.
Okay.
And the majority of refugees have disabilities, or they, because they've been in a war-torn country, or they wouldn't be refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And they've lived in a resettlement camp, where there's all kinds of disease and malnutrition and all sorts of things going on. And so they've been through it before they get here, and they have no idea how to function in America as a able-bodied person,
Mm-hmm.
much less what to do as a person with a disability. So
Mm-hmm.
we've tried to educate all of the refugee resettlement agencies and different organizations that help them, try to get them to recognize people with disabilities and know some of the basic resources so that they can refer people to the right place.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's one of our big accomplishments. And we've been working hard for the last 7 years on getting emergency planners and first responders to understand some of the special considerations that they need to make for people with disabilities, for making them aware of of the issues,
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that we're likely to have tornadoes here, or we're likely to have flooding in this particular neighborhood, and then what they can do, and then what special accommodations the people with disabilities might need in a sheltering situation or evacuation situation.
Mm-hmm.
And when we started this, nobody had ever heard of it or thought about it. But now it's on the agenda of every major conference that they have in Georgia about emergency planning, something about disability. So we've really worked hard in that field, and I'm very proud of what we've done. And in fact, of course, the federal government has really picked up the ball and run with it. In 2006, when we started this project in Georgia, there was nothing at the federal level on including people with disabilities. But now there's a whole department within Homeland Security on including people with disabilities in planning for safety things. And then we've worked with a lot of state agencies, and a lot of county agencies, police departments, and labor department, DFACs, and of course health departments, just helping them understand good customer service when your customers have disabilities.
Who were some of the people that come to mind that were instrumental in getting what you're talking about, getting society to change, to in a sense, to get these laws passed and to
in Georgia or in the country?
Well, let's say who comes to your mind in Georgia?
One of the people, Jim Carey, who not the school superintendent, but another Jim Carey, who was a veteran and is in a wheelchair. He is an attorney, and he actually filed a lawsuit against Califano, who was the secretary of, they used to call it HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, back under Carter.
Okay.
And he filed a lawsuit. Jim lives here in Atlanta, to get the regulations for the Rehabilitation Act, which is the first law that says you can't discriminate just because a person has a disability. He fought to get those out. And then, of course, there's a lot of folks who in Georgia who have protested and tied themselves to buses and to gates, the ADAPT group, and I guess the leaders in that would be like Mark Johnson over at Shepherd, and Pat Puckett, who's the head of the statewide Independent Living Council, and then a whole lot of other people too, not just those two, but they're kind of leaders in Georgia. And then there's a huge number of parents of children with disabilities who have fought a lot for the Medicaid waivers in Georgia and more money to help people have the supports they needed to live in the community. And of course, Sue Jamison is an attorney at Legal Aid who sort of began the case of LC versus Olmstead, which was the big case back in 2000. And it was actually Georgia said we can't close our institutions, that we can't provide local services for people. We shouldn't have to do that. You can't tell a state what to do. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you do, according to the ADA, you have to provide the least restrictive environment and serve people who wish to get out of the hospitals in their own communities. And of course, that's the norm now everywhere. Georgia's still behind on that, but they're slowly moving in that direction, sort of. And so LC is right here in Atlanta. She lived in a hospital a long time, mental hospital, mental and for people with developmental disabilities. And she has become an artist. She has support people that help her now live independently. And one of her paintings is hanging in the White House.
My goodness. Can you talk about the let's say, okay, so you had an institution like Milledgeville, and then they bring the people, now they close Milledgeville basically, and people are in the community, and nowadays with there's I believe there's medication that a lot of people can take where they can, in a sense, be mainstreamed into society. But in some instances, let's say some of the homeless don't take their medicine, and so then they have psychotic episodes.
And that's, of course, the problem is there's not enough outpatient places and not enough support places where people have some if you've got a choice between living in a mental hospital and living in a box, there's a heck of a lot of people that'd rather live in a box. And you and I might be two of those people that we fortunately have never had to make that decision. But and a lot of the people who are in the mental hospitals are people with developmental disabilities, not just people with, quote, psychiatric diagnoses.
Okay.
So Brook Run was one of the first ones to close in Georgia, and that was all people, mostly people with like cerebral palsy, and people who were just medically fragile, but who were put in there when they were babies.
Okay.
And if all they needed was one of the movers and shakers in Georgia is Bernard Baker,
Okay.
who was one of the first people to try to ride the bus, and he crawled on the bus and pulled his wheelchair up behind him. And he was at Brook Run, and he's a wonderful man, and he didn't have a chance. Because he was locked away in an institution without access to appropriate education or physical therapy or any of that. And he lives in his apartment now and has friends and goes all over the city and the country. He's an ADAPT. And so, there were a lot of people that were put in state hospitals. I've known a lot of blind people that for some reason or other, when they were born to the families, probably a doctor told them, this child's going to be a vegetable. It's no point in hurting everybody in the family. You've got your other children to think about. Just put them away. And that's how mental hospitals was a place to put people away, not necessarily people who were mentally ill.
Okay.
And now, if you spend very much time in them, you probably become mentally ill.
Yeah. You said Bernard Baker was in ADAPT. Is ADAPT an organization?
Yes, ADAPT is I said Mark Johnson and Pat Puckett and Bernard Baker. ADAPT is the group of people who march and sit in and that kind of thing. Okay. It's just a disability group nationwide.
Okay. What would you say some of your from your previous positions that you've held, and like even earlier volunteer work and things like that? Previous positions, what you've been doing the last 10 years, 20 years, what has been helpful? What lessons have you learned from earlier in your life that's been helpful for you in the last 2 decades or so?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think probably the most important work that I've done in the last 20 years as part of DRG has been listening to people and being supportive of people. People call on the phone, and they may call and say, I'm putting in a new bathroom in a high-rise building and I need to have this much clearance. Can I have the door go this way, or does it have to go that way? Architectural kinds of questions. And that's okay, and I'm trained to answer those. But to me, the really vitally important ones are when a woman calls and she says, I've just found out that my grandson is autistic, and we have no idea what to do. What should we do? That's my daughter.
Okay.
And I may listen. I may listen for a long time and talk for a long time, because we adopted our son who has autism. And so we can talk as two moms or two grandmas. I'm a grandma too now. And, and I'm just there for that person. And I couldn't do that if I was in a great big agency. But all my counseling, training, and the work I've done like at Duke and all that, my graduate degrees, that's prepared me for being a good listener, empathetic, not just talking about my life, but just giving the people, and they'll say, I said, I'm sorry that I can't help you more. They may be asking me a question about education, and I can say, well, there's just a limited things that educators can do for kids with autism, but here's some options, and then I'll say, I'm sorry I can't be of more help and concretely, and they say, well, you've just been there for me, and that makes all the difference. And so I think
that's the thing that I've always had to struggle with. And I go back to Mother Teresa's writings, where she says, you have to love one person at a time. You can't get overwhelmed by the fact that we need to change the laws in India so that there's not this terrible poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't get overwhelmed trying to change the law and lose contact with the individual people.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I said earlier, if people feel empowered and valuable and important themselves, then they don't need me. They can ask for what they need.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is they feel like I don't deserve anything. It's not your job to take care of my problems.
Can you talk a little bit about your interactions with organizations like Warm Springs or other similar type of?
I'd really rather not. I mean, I am appalled. I'll just say this. I am part of the reason that I'm retiring right now is because I am so frustrated and disgusted by the lack of services that are available from agencies that exist to provide those services. They've had cutbacks, and so they've cut back on services, and they've cut back on the people doing those services, and they've hired developers. And I'm not talking about Warm Springs now.
Yeah.
I haven't had that much relationship at all with Warm Springs, but just a lot of agencies. They've cut back on their services. They hire people to raise money, and then the people that are raising money so that they can hire more people to raise money. And right now, I just am appalled at how little service is being produced by agencies getting lots and lots of money and not doing what they should be doing. And if they would just, if we just take all the money that a lot of these agencies are getting and divide it up between the people with disabilities, we'd probably be a lot better off. Of course, there's a lot of folks with disabilities who might be like NFL football players. There's always 5 people standing around waiting to take it away from you. So, it's a really hard question. But there's just, I figured out one time there are 13 people that are employed because my son has a disability. At least 13. And that's crazy.
The over time you've been a student, a counselor, an educator, and an advocate. And at what points in your life, have you felt as one dominated over the other, or are they all mixed together, or how do you feel like you're sort of a synthesis of all that, or?
I suppose that what if you ask me, who do you want to say you are? I don't know what Jesse Jackson calls himself. I can't imagine, but his big thing was you are somebody, and I don't know whether that's advocating not at the system. I do that too, because you have to do both. But more importantly, I advocate to people, you are somebody. You can do, you can accomplish, you can make a difference. And so I would be a cheerleader, I guess. Even though I'd be horrified to think I am a cheerleader, but that's what I would say probably I am, is I really want people to understand that they can make a difference, that they have things to contribute, and that they can make their system change. We are a democracy. If we don't make things change, it's just because we're not all gathering together to try. We're saying, oh, well, we can't do anything. And of course you can't if you say that.
I mean, there's a bit, I perceive that there's been a lot of strides that have been made, and I'm just wondering if do you have a sense as to the trajectory? I know there's a lot of budget cuts and things like that, but are some of the things that we've accomplished being eroded, or do you think that we continue to improvements continue to be made for people to make the most of this different situations?
Well, I think that, I think that the majority of people with disabilities, are not on the bandwagon to ask for what they need. They're passive. And there's a lot of people without disabilities, of course, who are passive. But there are folks who are really, making a difference, and you can, go to websites and look at all the people who are, doing things, who have whole office, who teach, who are professors, who the head of SETI, what does that stand for? Anyway, it's the people looking for life in other planets. Is a blind person, and there's people, I'm always looking for, of course, blind people, and I said autism and Asperger's. Nobody knew about that 20 years ago, and now most everybody knows something about that. And it's not because it's just happened. It's because everybody used to just say those people were retarded or weird. They've always been here. And, I think that, that with the publication of lots of books by people with disabilities and movies, and I think we're going forward. I think we're going in a good direction. Obviously, any time you can lose, we could get a president in 2 years or 4 years, whatever it is, 3 years. We could get a president who wants to go back to funding wars instead of education or something, and lose some. We lost some for the first 8 years of this century, and it takes a while to gain those back. But I don't think the disability community will let things go back too far. When Newt Gingrich was elected Speaker of the House and had a Republican majority, and he talked about, we're going to repeal IDEA, we're going to push back ADA to make it make sense for the businessman, and blah, 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 blah. People with disabilities in Georgia said, you can't do that. You're a Georgia representative. And we had over 200 people with disabilities met with him in small groups, not a great big meeting, but small groups, just to say, this is what it's like to be deaf, or this is what it's like to be blind, or this is what it's like to work in supported employment. Because he didn't know about those things. He had never had to pay attention. And so IDEA nor ADA lost any ground under Newt's leadership. But it took us organizing and meeting with him, not in a confrontational way, but in a let us tell you so that you know.
Are there some areas where is there anything that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked about?
Well, I think it's important for me to say that my family, my husband, my children, have been really important in, and a lot of the folks who've worked with me over the last 20 years, and even before that. I at my retirement party, I said, you are the wind beneath my wings, and that's really true. I couldn't have done this job without my husband, because I didn't make any money to speak of, and I mean very little. And because, I put it back into the agency so that we could do the things that we needed to do. And I couldn't have done that had my husband not have been fully encouraging, and he certainly has encouraged me to be who I can be, and he's always been very, you can do it, go for it, that attitude. And my kids too, and it's just, and I have friends that have been very encouraging, and so it's a lot of people have helped me do the things that I felt like I needed to do.
What do you see as still needs to be done out there?
Well, we need to do a lot better job educating people with disabilities we spend a lot of time talking about special education, and there's a lot of kids with disabilities who don't need special education, but who need some supports in the school, and they or their parents may not want them diagnosed, they don't want them to be different, or their kids don't want to be different, and so they don't get those supports. So we need to have the school really speak out that people with disabilities have all kinds of skills and abilities. And again, I'm not just talking, usually whenever you talk about education and disability, you think of just special ed.
Mm-hmm.
But there's hundreds of kids in regular ed, who have thousands of kids in regular ed in Georgia, who need supports that may not be getting enough,
Mm-hmm.
and may not even be diagnosed with needing supports.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the first thing, because people can't get jobs if they don't have skills.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really would like to see us do a lot more. I would love to do a program just going into middle schools and talking about living my life with a disability, just so that kids with and without disabilities, could hear that. And the kids without disabilities, supposedly, many of them have disabilities that since they do good in school and they don't cause trouble, nobody notices.
Mm-hmm. Are you okay with ending it there?
Huh.
Do you want to talk some more? Do you want to?
Well, I think that's a good place to end.
Okay. Okay.